in the tranquil village of St. Mary Mead, a single gunshot shatters the peace of the vicarage, leaving Colonel Lucius Prothero dead in a locked study. Who slipped through the shadows to silence him? Was it the nervous curate hiding a secret, the colonel's own daughter clutching a burned letter, or the enigmatic newcomer with lipstick on a teacup? Join Miss Jane Marple with her unerring eye for human nature as she unravels a web of lies, betrayal, and murder. Will the truth emerge before another secret strikes? Listen and discover the deadly truth. Chapter 1. The Quiet of St. Mary Mead. The village of St. Mary Mead lay nestled in the gentle folds of the English countryside, its thatched cottages and winding lanes bathed in the soft light of an autumn afternoon. October 12th, 1925. The air carried the faint scent of wood smoke, and the church bells tolled 4 o'clock with a languid precision that seemed to hush the world into stillness. It was a place where time moved slowly, where secrets were whispered behind lace curtains, and where the residents prided themselves on their quiet, unassuming lives. Yet, beneath this tranquil surface, a current of unease rippled through the vicarage at the edge of the village where the Reverend Leonard Clement lived with his young wife Griselda and their small circle of confidants. The vicarage, a handsome Georgian house with ivy clinging to its weathered bricks, was the heart of St. Mary Mead's social life. That afternoon, its drawing-room buzzed with the polite chatter of a small gathering. The occasion was a modest tea, hosted by Griselda to welcome the new arrival in the village, Miss Eleanor Price, a sharp-eyed woman of 40 with a penchant for expensive hats and an air of guarded mystery. Around the mahogany table sat the usual assembly: Dr. John Haydock, the village physician whose gruff manner belied a keen mind; Mrs. Martha Price, Eleanor's widowed aunt, whose nervous fidgeting betrayed her discomfort in company; Colonel Lucius Prothero, a retired military man with a temper as fiery as his red face; and his daughter Lettice, a dreamy young woman of 20, who seemed perpetually distracted by thoughts she never shared. The vicar himself presided over the gathering, his gentle smile masking a weariness brought on by parish disputes. Miss Jane Marple, the village's most unassuming yet sharpest observer, sat quietly in a corner, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she listened. Her pale blue eyes, deceptively mild, darted from face to face, noting the small tensions that others overlooked. The way Colonel Prothero's hand tightened on his teacup when Eleanor Price spoke, the way Mrs. Price's fingers twisted her handkerchief when Griselda mentioned the vicarage's recent financial troubles, and the way Lettice's gaze lingered on the window, as if longing to escape. "It's a charming village," Eleanor Price was saying, her voice smooth but edged with a hint of condescension. "Though I confess I find the quiet almost oppressive. One wonders what secrets such a place hides." Griselda laughed, her youthful exuberance a contrast to the room's restraint. "Oh, St. Mary Mead is full of secrets, Miss Price, but they're mostly about who forgot to return a borrowed book or whose roses won at last year's fete." The group chuckled, but Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. She had heard the undertone in Eleanor's words, the probing quality that suggested more than idle curiosity. Colonel Prothero, however, was less amused. "Secrets?" he barked, his moustache bristling. "Nonsense! This village is as dull as dishwater. If you want intrigue, go to London." "Perhaps," Eleanor replied, her smile tight. "But I've found that even the smallest places can hide the darkest deeds." The conversation shifted to parish matters, but Miss Marple's attention remained fixed on the undercurrents. She noted the time, 4:15 p.m., when Colonel Prothero excused himself to take a telephone call in the vicar's study, his heavy footsteps echoing down the hall. She observed Mrs. Price's quick glance at her niece, as if seeking reassurance, and the way Lettice Prothero slipped a folded piece of paper into her pocket when she thought no one was watching. Dr. Haydock, meanwhile, seemed preoccupied, his fingers drumming on the arm of his chair as he stole glances at the clock. By 5 p.m., the tea had concluded, and the guests began to disperse. Colonel Prothero returned from his call, his face flushed with irritation, muttering about insolent demands. He left abruptly, promising to return later that evening to discuss parish accounts with the vicar. Eleanor and Mrs. Price departed together, the older woman leaning heavily on her niece's arm. Lettice lingered, offering to help Griselda clear the tea things, though her efforts were half-hearted, her eyes drifting to the garden. Miss Marple, gathering her knitting, offered her usual mild farewells, but her mind was already at work. She had seen too much in her years in St. Mary Mead to dismiss the subtle signs, the strained smiles, the guarded glances, the words left unsaid. As she stepped into the crisp evening air, she felt a prickle of foreboding. Something was amiss in St. Mary Mead, and she suspected it would not remain hidden for long. That evening, at precisely 6:30 p.m., a scream shattered the vicarage's quiet. Griselda, pale and trembling, burst into the drawing-room where Miss Marple had returned for a forgotten shawl. "It's Colonel Prothero," she gasped. "He's dead, in the study, shot." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her calm demeanour unshaken. "My dear," she said softly, "we must fetch the police. And then, perhaps, we shall see what secrets St. Mary Mead has been keeping." As the village clock struck 7, the vicarage was transformed from a haven of peace into a stage for tragedy. The stage was set, the players assembled, and Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom and unerring instinct, knew that the truth lay hidden in the details she had already begun to collect. Chapter 2. The scene of the crime, the vicarage study, usually a sanctuary of books and quiet reflection, was now a tableau of chaos and death. Colonel Lucius Prothero lay slumped across the Reverend Leonard Clement's desk, his head resting on a blotter stained with ink and blood. A small, precise bullet hole marred his temple, and a revolver lay on the floor beside him. Glinting in the dim light of a single lamp, the clock on the mantelpiece ticked relentlessly, marking 7:05 p.m. on October 12, 1925, as the village of St. Mary Mead grappled with the shock of murder. Miss Jane Marple stood just inside the doorway, her slight figure almost lost in the shadow of Inspector Slack, the local police officer who bustled about with an air of self-important efficiency. His notebook was already open, his pencil scratching furiously as he barked orders to Constable Hurst, who was attempting to keep the curious household at bay. Griselda, still pale from her discovery, hovered near her husband, the vicar, whose face was a mask of disbelief. The room was heavy with the scent of gunpowder and the faint mustiness of old books. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and unyielding, took in every detail. The study was small, its walls lined with shelves of theological tomes and parish records. The desk, a sturdy oak affair, was cluttered with papers, a half-finished sermon, and a teacup, its contents cold. The window behind the desk was slightly ajar, letting in a chill breeze that stirred the curtains. A single sheet of paper, folded and slightly crumpled, lay near the revolver, its edges catching the lamplight. Inspector Slack, a man whose brusque manner belied a certain competence, turned to the vicar. "Reverend Clement, you say you were in the garden when you heard the shot at 6:30 p.m. "Yes," Leonard replied, his voice steady but strained. "I was tending to the roses. Griselda was in the kitchen, preparing supper. We heard the scream, Griselda's scream, and I ran inside to find her in the hall, pointing to the study." "And you, Mrs. Clement?" Slack's tone was clipped, his eyes narrowing as he studied Griselda's trembling hands. I was coming to fetch Leonard for supper," Griselda stammered. "I passed the study door, and it was ajar. I saw him, Colonel Prothero. I screamed and ran to find Leonard." Miss Marple noted the slight hesitation in Griselda's words, the way her eyes darted to her husband for reassurance. She also observed the vicar's clenched jaw, a sign of suppressed emotion. The inspector, oblivious to these subtleties, moved to the body crouching to examine the revolver. "Looks like a Webley," he muttered. "Common enough. No fingerprints, I'll wager. Too clean." He glanced at the paper on the floor. "And? What's this? A note?" Constable Hurst retrieved the paper with gloved hands, unfolding it carefully. The words, written in a hurried scrawl, read, "I know what you did. You'll pay." The inspector's eyebrows shot up. Well, a threat. This complicates things." Miss Marple, still silent, stepped closer to the desk, her gaze lingering on the teacup. Its saucer was slightly askew, and a faint ring of tea stained the blotter beneath it. She noted the time on the clock, 7:10 p.m., and the position of the window, which faced the garden path leading to the vicarage gate. Her mind catalogued these details, each a thread in the tapestry of the crime. The household was summoned to the drawing-room, where Inspector Slack began his initial inquiries. Dr. Haydock, who had arrived shortly after the police, confirmed the time of death as approximately 6:30 p.m., based on the body's temperature and rigidity. "Single shot to the head," he said gruffly. "Death was instantaneous." Miss Marple listened as the inspector questioned the others. Lettice Prothero, the colonel's daughter, was tearful but vague, claiming she had been in her room at the Prothero estate, a mile away, at the time of the murder. "I didn't even know Father was coming here tonight," she said, her voice trembling. "He was supposed to be at home, going over accounts." Mrs. Martha Price, pale and clutching her handkerchief, said she and her niece Eleanor had returned to their cottage after the tea and remained there all evening. "We were together," she insisted, her voice high and nervous. "We heard nothing until the church bells rang for 7. Eleanor Price, however, was calmer, her dark eyes meeting the inspector's with a cool defiance. "I was reading in the parlour," she said. "Aunt Martha was with me. We had no reason to come back to the vicarage." Miss Marple's knitting needles, tucked into her bag, remained still as she absorbed these alibis. She noted the time discrepancies. Lettice's claim of being at home, yet the Prothero estate was a brisk 20-minute walk from the vicarage. Mrs. Price's insistence on the church bells, which had not rung at 7 that evening, and Eleanor's precise mention of reading, yet no book was mentioned during the tea. These were small things, but to Miss Marple, small things were the keys to great truths. As the inspector dismissed the group, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze returning to the study. She approached the window, noting the faint scuff mark on the sill, as if someone had climbed through in haste. Outside, the garden path was visible, its gravel undisturbed except for a single, deep footprint near the gate, partially obscured by fallen leaves. She made a mental note of its size and shape. Large, likely a man's shoe, but oddly shallow for its depth. "Miss Marple!" Inspector Slack called, his tone impatient. "This is no place for an elderly lady. Leave the detecting to us." She smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling with a quiet resolve. "Of course, Inspector. I was merely admiring the vicar's roses." But as she turned to leave, her mind was already weaving the threads of the crime, alibis, footprints, a teacup, a note, into a pattern only she could see. Colonel Prothero's death was no random act, and Miss Marple knew that the truth lay hidden in the ordinary, waiting for her little grey cells to uncover it. Chapter 3. The Arrival of Insight. The morning of October 13th, 1925, dawned grey and heavy over St. Mary Mead, the clouds mirroring the sombre mood that had settled over the village. The vicarage, once a beacon of quiet hospitality, now hummed with the comings and goings of police constables and curious villagers, their whispers forming a low murmur outside the gates. Inside, Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking softly, a picture of calm amid the storm. She had returned at the vicar's invitation, ostensibly to offer comfort to Griselda, but her true purpose was clear to her alone, to observe, to listen, and to unravel the threads of Colonel Prothero's murder. The vicar, Reverend Leonard Clement, paced the room, his usually serene demeanour frayed by the events of the previous evening. Griselda, curled in an armchair, clutched a cup of tea that had long gone cold, her eyes red from sleeplessness. The arrival of Miss Marple, with her unassuming presence and gentle inquiries, seemed to steady them both, though the weight of the tragedy lingered. "I simply cannot believe it," Leonard said, pausing by the fireplace. "Colonel Prothero, of all people, here in my study. It's unthinkable." "Unthinkable, perhaps," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but precise, "but not impossible. The human heart, my dear vicar, is capable of great darkness, even in a place as peaceful as St. Mary Mead." Griselda looked up, her expression a mix of fear and curiosity. "Do you think it was someone we know, Miss Marple? Someone at the tea yesterday?" Miss Marple's needles paused, her pale blue eyes meeting Griselda's with a quiet intensity. "I think, my dear, that the truth lies in what we do not yet see clearly, but we shall see it in time." At that moment the doorbell chimed, and a maid ushered in Dr. John Haydock, his face grim but composed. He carried his medical bag, though his visit was not professional. "I've just come from the police station," he said, settling into a chair. "Slack's convinced it's a straightforward case. Someone with a grudge against Prothero, likely over money or land. He's got his eye on young Dennis, the gardener's boy, who had a row with the colonel last week." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "Dennis? A boy of 16, with no more motive than a harsh word from a man known for his temper? That seems hasty." Haydock shrugged, his gruffness softening in her presence. "Slack's not one for subtleties. But I'll admit, the note they found, I know what you did. You'll pay suggests something personal. Prothero wasn't a man to make friends easily. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack himself, his brisk manner filling the room with an air of authority. He carried a small notebook, its pages already filled with scribbled notes. Mrs. Clement, Reverend, I'll need to speak with everyone who was at the tea yesterday. And Miss Marple, he added, his tone grudging. I suppose you'll want to listen in, though I warn you, this is police business. I wouldn't dream of interfering, Miss Marple said mildly, her needles resuming their rhythm. I am merely here to offer support to my friends. Slack grunted, unconvinced, but proceeded to outline the facts as he saw them. Colonel Prothero had been shot at approximately 6:30 p.m., based on Griselda's scream and Dr. Haydock's examination. The revolver, a Webley, was unregistered but common in military circles, and no fingerprints were found. The note suggested premeditation, but the open window and the footprint in the garden hinted at an outsider. We're checking alibis, Slack said. Everyone claims to have been elsewhere, but alibis can be broken. Miss Marple listened intently, her mind cataloguing the details. She recalled the tea at 4 p.m. when Colonel Prothero had taken a telephone call in the study, returning at 4:45 p.m. with a flushed face. She remembered Lettice Prothero's distracted air, slipping a folded paper into her pocket, and Mrs. Price's nervous fidgeting whenever money was mentioned. Eleanor Price's cool demeanour, too, had struck her as oddly controlled, as if guarding a secret. And then there was the teacup on the desk, its saucer askew, a detail that nagged at her, though she could not yet say why. "Inspector," she ventured, her voice gentle, "have you considered the teacup in the study? It was cold when I saw it, yet the tea was served at 4. Surely Colonel Prothero did not linger over a cold cup for 2 hours." Slack frowned, caught off guard. "A teacup, likely left from the afternoon. Servants are careless." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone neutral, but her eyes sharp. "But the vicarage staff are not careless, Inspector, and the cup was on the blotter, not the tray where the others were collected." Slack made a note, though his expression suggested he found the observation trivial. He turned to the vicar. "Reverend, you said Prothero was coming back to discuss parish accounts. Any reason someone might want him out of the way over that?" Leonard hesitated, his fingers tightening on the back of a chair. The colonel was difficult about money. He was pushing to audit the parish funds, claiming discrepancies. I assured him everything was in order, but he was insistent. Miss Marple's needles paused again. "Discrepancies?" she asked softly. "That is most interesting." Griselda, who had been silent, spoke up suddenly. "It's true. He was horrid about it, said someone was stealing from the church. He even accused poor Mr. Hawes, our curate, of mismanagement, but Mr. Hawes is the kindest man." "Accusations can breed resentment," Miss Marple murmured, her mind turning to the curate, a nervous young man who had not attended the tea, but was often seen hovering near the vicarage. She made a mental note to speak with him. As Slack continued his questions, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the garden path and the footprint she had noticed the previous evening. It was large, yes, but shallow, as if the person had stepped lightly or hesitated. She also recalled the scuff mark on the windowsill, suggesting someone had entered or exited the study. These were not the signs of a random intruder, but of someone familiar with the vicarage's layout. The interview concluded, and Slack departed to question Lettice Prothero and the Price women at their respective homes. Dr. Haydock lingered, his gaze thoughtful. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "you see more than you let on. What do you make of this?" She smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling. "I make nothing yet, Doctor. But I observe that people are rarely what they seem, and Colonel Prothero's death is no simple matter. There is a pattern here, and I shall find it." As she gathered her knitting and prepared to leave, Miss Marple's mind was alight with possibilities. The teacup, the footprint, the note, the parish accounts, all were pieces of a puzzle that pointed to a deeper truth. She knew that the murderer was someone close, someone who had sat at the tea table, smiling politely while hiding a motive as dark as the deed itself. With her little grey cells at work, Miss Marple stepped into the misty morning, determined to uncover the secrets that St. Mary Mead held so tightly. Chapter 4. The Questions Begin. The afternoon of October 13th, 1925, brought a damp chill to St. Mary Mead, the kind that seeped into the bones and sharpened the senses. In the vicarage drawing-room, Miss Jane Marple sat with her knitting, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow, yet her pale blue eyes missed nothing. The room, still heavy with the aftermath of Colonel Prothero's murder, was now a stage for Inspector Slack's interrogations. He had summoned the key figures from the previous day's tea to the vicarage, determined to piece together their movements and motives. Miss Marple, invited by Griselda to provide moral support, listened with quiet intensity, her needles clicking like a metronome of thought. Inspector Slack stood by the fireplace, his notebook open, his manner brisk but methodical. "We'll go through this systematically," he announced, his voice cutting through the room's tension. "Each of you was at the vicarage yesterday afternoon. I want to know where you were between 6 p.m. and 6:30 p.m. when the shot was fired. No omissions, no evasions." The group assembled was a study in contrasts. Griselda, pale and fidgeting, clung to Leonard's arm. Dr. Haydock, his gruff exterior softened by concern, leaned against the mantel. Lettice Prothero, her eyes red from crying, sat with a distant air. Mrs. Martha Price, her hands twisting her handkerchief, darted nervous glances at her niece, and Eleanor Price, composed and sharp-eyed, met Slack's gaze with cool defiance. The vicar, standing by the window, looked as if he carried the weight of the parish's sins. Miss Marple noted the time, 2:15 p.m., and the way the light fell through the lace curtains, casting delicate shadows on the faces of the suspects. She had already formed a mental map of the vicarage, the study's position at the back of the house, its window overlooking the garden path, the hall connecting it to the drawing-room and kitchen, and the gate leading to the lane. Every detail mattered, and she was determined to let none escape her. Slack began with Griselda. "Mrs. Clement, you said you were in the kitchen at 6:30 p.m. when you heard the shot. Anyone with you?" Griselda nodded, her voice unsteady. "Mary, our maid, was there, peeling potatoes. I was setting the table for supper. I stepped into the hall to call Leonard and saw the study door ajar. That's when I saw him." Her voice broke, and Leonard placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Slack scribbled a note. "And you, Reverend Clement?" "You were in the garden?" "Yes," Leonard replied, his tone measured. "I was pruning the roses near the gate. I heard Griselda scream and ran inside. I didn't hear the shot itself. The wind was up, and I was focused on my work." Miss Marple's needles paused briefly. The garden gate was a mere 20 yards from the study window, yet Leonard claimed not to have heard the shot. She recalled the shallow footprint near the gate, its edges blurred by leaves. Could a man as attentive as the vicar have missed such a sound? Next, Slack turned to Lettice Prothero. "Miss Prothero, you said you were at home, a mile away, at 6:30 p.m. Can anyone confirm that?" Lettice's voice was soft, almost dreamy. "I was in my room, reading. Our housekeeper, Mrs. Lestrange, was downstairs. She might have heard me moving about. I didn't know Father was at the vicarage until the police came." Slack's eyes narrowed. "A mile's walk takes 20 minutes, Miss Prothero. You could have been here and back. Your father wasn't popular, was he? Any reason you might have wanted him gone?" Lettice's face flushed, but her voice remained steady. "Father was difficult, but I loved him. I had no reason to do such a thing." Miss Marple noted the girl's clenched hands, the way her eyes flickered toward the window. Lettice's alibi was flimsy, and her distracted air suggested something unspoken. Had she been at the vicarage, unseen? Or was her grief masking another emotion? Mrs. Martha Price was next, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Eleanor and I were at our cottage, Inspector. We returned there after tea around 5 p.m. We were together all evening in the parlour. I was knitting and Eleanor was reading. We heard nothing until the church bells at 7. "There were no bells at 7, Miss Marple interjected gently, her tone almost apologetic. "The church clock was being repaired yesterday, Mrs. Price." The older woman's face paled, and she stammered, "Oh, I must have misheard." Perhaps it was earlier. Eleanor's expression remained impassive, but her fingers tightened on the arm of her chair. "My aunt is mistaken, Inspector. We were home, as she said. I was reading the Times, the evening edition. We had no reason to return to the vicarage." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on Eleanor. The mention of the Times was specific, yet the evening edition was not delivered to St. Mary Mead until 6:45 p.m., as she knew from her own routine. Could Eleanor have received it earlier, or was this a slip? Dr. Haydock was the last to speak. "I was at my surgery seeing a patient, Mrs. Archer, with a sprained ankle. Left around 6 p.m. and walked home. I was in my study by 6:30, writing notes. My housekeeper can confirm I was there." Slack nodded, jotting down the details. "Right, we'll check these alibis. Anyone else see or hear anything unusual around 6:30 p.m.? The room was silent, but Miss Marple's mind was far from still. She recalled the teacup in the study, its cold contents puzzling her. She thought of the note, "I know what you did. You'll pay," and its hurried scrawl, suggesting urgency or anger. She considered the open window and the scuff mark on the sill, which could indicate an intruder or a staged exit. And then there was the parish accounts, which Colonel Prothero had been so keen to audit. Money, she knew, was a powerful motive. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple approached the vicar quietly. "Leonard, might I see the parish ledger? The one Colonel Prothero was concerned about." Leonard hesitated, then nodded. "It's in the study, but the police have sealed it off. I can fetch it later. Why do you ask?" "Oh, merely curiosity," she said with a smile. "I find numbers often tell stories that words do not." That evening, as she walked home through the misty lanes, Miss Marple's mind churned. The alibis were too neat, too rehearsed, yet each contained a flaw, a missed bell, a vague timeline, a cold teacup. She thought of the curate, Mr. Hawes, absent from the tea but implicated in Prothero's accusations. She recalled Lettuce's folded paper, slipped into her pocket during the tea, and she pondered Eleanor Price's cool precision, which seemed to hide a deeper calculation. The truth, Miss Marple knew, was like her knitting. A pattern emerged only when every stitch was in place. She would need to probe deeper, to ask the right questions and observe the smallest details. As she reached her cottage, the church clock struck 6 p.m., and she smiled faintly. The game was afoot, and her little grey cells were ready to unravel the mystery of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 5. The Red Herrings. The morning of October 14th, 1925, broke with a thin mist clinging to the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead, lending the village an air of secrecy that matched the undercurrents of suspicion now rippling through its lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat in her small, tidy parlour, her knitting abandoned on the table, as she sipped tea and reviewed her notes. Mental notes, for she never committed her observations to paper. The murder of Colonel Lucius Prothero had stirred the village into a frenzy, and Inspector Slack's investigation, though diligent, seemed to Miss Marple to be veering toward the obvious, a path she knew often led to error. Inspector Slack had fixed his attention on Dennis, the gardener's boy, a lanky lad of 16 with a reputation for mischief. The boy's public quarrel with Colonel Prothero over a trespassing incident. Prothero had accused him of stealing apples from the estate orchard, had become the talk of the village. Slack, with his penchant for straightforward solutions, believed the threatening note found in the study. "I know what you did. You'll pay," could be Dennis's work, penned in youthful anger. The revolver, too, was a common model, and Slack speculated that Dennis might have pilfered it from his father's shed, where old military gear was rumoured to be stored. Miss Marple, however, was sceptical. She had seen Dennis at the church fete, a boy more prone to pranks than violence, his temper quick but fleeting. The note's scrawl, she reasoned, suggested an adult's hand, not a boy's impulsive scribble. Moreover, the shallow footprint in the garden and the scuff mark on the study windowsill pointed to a more calculated act than a teenager's outburst. Yet she let Slack pursue his theory, knowing that red herrings often cleared the way to truth by exposing the flaws in hasty assumptions. At 10 a.m., Miss Marple walked to the vicarage where Griselda had invited her for coffee. The atmosphere was strained, with the police still combing the grounds and villagers lingering at the gate, whispering theories. Griselda, her usual vivacity dimmed, greeted Miss Marple with a wan smile. "It's awful, Miss Marple. Everyone's talking about Dennis now, saying he did it, but he's just a boy." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, settling into a chair. "And boys, my dear, are rarely as cunning as murderers must be. Tell me, has Inspector Slack spoken to Mr. Hawes yet?" Griselda frowned. "The curate? Not that I know of. Why do you ask?" "Oh, merely a thought," Miss Marple said, her tone light but her eyes keen. "Colonel Prothero's accusations about the parish accounts must have troubled Mr. Hawes greatly." Leonard, entering with a tray of coffee, overheard. "Hawes is a nervous sort," he said, setting the tray down. "Prothero's talk of discrepancies upset him terribly. He swore the accounts were in order, but Prothero wouldn't listen. Said he'd have an auditor in by next week." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. An auditor? That would have been illuminating. Have you the ledger, Leonard? He nodded, retrieving a leather-bound book from a locked drawer in the hall. Slack allowed me to fetch it this morning. It's all here. Offerings, expenses, donations. I've gone over it myself. Everything balances. Miss Marple opened the ledger, her fingers tracing the neat columns of figures. She noted the dates. Regular entries for Sunday collections. A large donation from Colonel Prothero himself on September 15th, and smaller sums from Mrs. Price and others. One entry caught her eye, a withdrawal of £50 on October 1st, marked only as miscellaneous expenses, and initialed by Mr. Hawes. She made no comment, but closed the ledger with a thoughtful nod. As they sipped coffee, Dr. Haydock arrived, his face etched with fatigue. "Slack's got Dennis in for questioning," he said, accepting a cup. "Poor lad's terrified. Says he was fishing at the river at 6:30 p.m, but no one saw him. Slack's convinced he's lying." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And you, Doctor? Do you think Dennis capable of such a crime?" Haydock hesitated, his gruff voice softening. "He's a hothead, but murder. Number besides, the shot was precise, clean through the temple. That's not a boy's aim. And the note, it feels too deliberate." "Quite so," Miss Marple murmured. She recalled the teacup in the study, its cold contents nagging at her. "Doctor, you were at the tea on October 12th. Did you see anyone linger in the study after Colonel Prothero's telephone call?" Haydock frowned, thinking. "Not that I recall. Prothero came back at 4:45, looking cross. Everyone was in the drawing room when I left at 5 o'clock. Except," he paused, "Lettice was in the hall, fetching her shawl. She seemed in a hurry." Miss Marple's needles, now resumed, clicked softly. Lettice's folded paper, slipped into her pocket during the tea, came to mind. Had she been in the study, perhaps leaving the note, or was she merely retrieving something innocent? The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Eleanor Price, her elegant hat and composed demeanour a stark contrast to the vicarage's gloom. She had come, she said, to offer condolences to Griselda. "Such a dreadful business," she remarked, her voice smooth. "I hear they suspect the gardener's boy. How tragic." Miss Marple observed Eleanor closely, noting the faint tension in her posture. "Miss Price," she said gently, "you mentioned reading the Times at 6:30 p.m. on the evening of the murder. The evening edition, I believe." Eleanor's eyes flickered, but her smile held. "Yes, I enjoy keeping up with the news. Why do you ask?" "Oh, merely curiosity," Miss Marple replied. "The delivery boy is so reliable, isn't he? Always at 6:45 p.m, I find." Eleanor's smile tightened, but she said nothing, turning instead to Griselda with a sympathetic word. Miss Marple noted the deflection, her mind turning to the timeline. If Eleanor had the evening edition at 6:30, she could not have been at her cottage as claimed, unless the paper was delivered earlier, which seemed unlikely. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple excused herself to visit the church, where she hoped to find Mr. Hawes. The curate was in the vestry, his thin frame hunched over a hymn book, his face pale and drawn. "Miss Marple," he said, startled. I didn't expect you." "I thought you might need a kind ear," she said, her voice soothing. "The Colonel's accusations must have been distressing." Hawes's hands trembled. "He was wrong, Miss Marple. The accounts are correct. I'd never steal from the church. But he wouldn't listen. said I was hiding something." "And were you?" she asked gently, her eyes searching his. He looked away, his voice barely a whisper. Not what he thought, but there are things one doesn't speak of. Miss Marple nodded, not pressing further. She left the church, her mind weaving together the threads. Dennis as the obvious suspect, yet unlikely. The ledger's mysterious withdrawal. Lettice's hurried movements. Eleanor's questionable alibi. And Hawes's unspoken secret. The red herrings were multiplying, but Miss Marple knew that beneath them lay the truth, waiting to be uncovered by her meticulous observation and unerring logic. As she walked home, the church clock struck noon, and she smiled faintly. The pattern was forming, stitch by stitch, and she was determined to see it through. Chapter 6. A Clue in Detail. The afternoon of October 14th, 1925, cast a pale, watery light over St. Mary Mead, the village's quiet lanes subdued under a veil of drizzle. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the weather, made her way to the vicarage, her umbrella shielding her from the rain but not from the weight of the mystery that consumed her thoughts. The murder of Colonel Lucius Prothero was a puzzle of intricate design, and she sensed that the key to its solution lay in a single overlooked detail. A gesture, a word, or an object that held more significance than anyone yet realized. At the vicarage, the atmosphere remained tense, with Inspector Slack's investigation casting a shadow over the household. Griselda, attempting to restore some normalcy, was arranging flowers in the drawing room when Miss Marple arrived. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her voice tinged with relief. "It's so good to see you. Everything feels so wrong since the murder." "My dear," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but firm, "things often feel wrong before they are made right. May I see the study again? I believe there is something I missed." Griselda hesitated, glancing toward the hall where a constable stood guard. "Inspector Slack's been very strict, but I suppose it's all right if you're quick. Leonard's at the church, and the police are out questioning Dennis again." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes twinkling with quiet determination. She entered the study, now cordoned off but accessible with Griselda's permission. The room was much as she had last seen it. The desk cluttered with papers, the cold teacup still askew on its saucer, the window slightly ajar, and the faint smell of gunpowder lingering in the air. The clock on the mantel read 2:30 p.m., its steady tick a reminder of time's relentless march. Her gaze settled on the teacup, which had nagged at her since the night of the murder. It was an ordinary piece of the vicarage's china set, white with a delicate rose pattern, but its position on the blotter, away from the tray where tea things were usually kept, was peculiar. She leaned closer, noting a faint smudge on the rim. A trace of lipstick, pale pink, almost imperceptible. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Griselda wore no lipstick, and the maid Mary was not one for such adornments. Who then had drunk from this cup? She turned her attention to the papers on the desk, careful not to disturb them. Among the vicar's sermon notes and parish correspondence was a single sheet, partially obscured by the blotter, bearing a list of names and figures in Colonel Prothero's bold handwriting. It appeared to be a draft of his proposed audit of the parish accounts, with one entry circled in red ink. Hawes, £50, October 1st, unaccounted. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The same withdrawal she had noted in the ledger, marked as miscellaneous expenses. The Colonel's suspicion was clear, but was it justified? Stepping to the window, she examined the sill, where the scuff marks she had noticed on the night of the murder remained. It was faint, a scrape of dirt and paint, suggesting someone had climbed through, either to enter or to stage an exit. Outside, the garden path was visible, its gravel still bearing the shallow footprint she had observed, now slightly eroded by the rain. She made a mental note to measure it later, suspecting it held more significance than Inspector Slack's cursory dismissal allowed. As she left the study, Griselda met her in the hall, her face anxious. "Did you find anything, Miss Marple?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft. "Tell me, my dear, did Lettice Prothero wear lipstick at the tea on October 12th? Griselda frowned, thinking. "Lettice? No, I don't think so. She's so natural, always a bit careless about her appearance. But Eleanor Price, she had that lovely pink shade. I noticed it because it matched her hat." Miss Marple nodded, filing away this detail. Eleanor Price, with her cool composure and questionable alibi, was emerging as a figure of interest. The lipstick smudge suggested she had been in the study, perhaps after the tea, but why? And how did it connect to the note, the footprint, or the parish accounts? That evening, Miss Marple attended a parish meeting at the church, where the village's shock over the murder was palpable. Mr. Hawes, the curate, was present, his nervous demeanour more pronounced than ever. His hands shook as he handed out hymn books, and his eyes darted toward the door as if expecting an interruption. Miss Marple approached him afterward, her manner disarming. "Mr. Hawes," she said, "you seem troubled. Is it the Colonel's accusations about the accounts?" He flinched, his voice low. I told you, Miss Marple, there's nothing wrong with the accounts. The £50 was for a charitable expense not recorded properly. A mistake, nothing more." "A mistake can be costly," she said gently, "especially when a man like Colonel Prothero takes notice. Did he confront you directly?" Hawes's face paled. "He came to the vestry on October 10th, shouting about theft. I tried to explain, but he wouldn't listen. He said he'd ruin me." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was sharp. Hawes's fear was genuine, but was it the fear of a guilty man, or a man wrongly accused? She thanked him and moved on, her thoughts turning to Lettice Prothero, who was absent from the meeting. A visit to the Prothero estate was in order. At 7 p.m, Miss Marple called on Lettice, finding her in the drawing-room staring at a photograph of her father. The girl's eyes were dry but haunted. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice distant, "do they really think Dennis did it?" "They think many things," Miss Marple replied, "but truth is rarely found in haste. Tell me, Lettice, that paper you slipped into your pocket at the tea, what was it?" Lettice's hand froze, her expression startled. It was nothing, a shopping list. I'd forgotten it." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A shopping list is easily remembered. Perhaps it was something more personal?" Lettice's gaze dropped, and she said nothing. Miss Marple did not press, but the girl's silence spoke volumes. As she left the estate, the drizzle had ceased, and the stars were emerging. The teacup's lipstick, the circled entry in Prothero's notes, the scuff mark, and Lettice's hidden paper. These were the stitches in the pattern, and Miss Marple felt them beginning to align. The murderer was close, their motive tied to the secrets of the vicarage, and she was determined to unravel the truth before another thread snapped. Chapter 7. More lies surface. The morning of October 15th, 1925, brought a fragile sunlight to St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself were hesitant to emerge from the shadow of Colonel Lucius Prothero's murder. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage, her knitting untouched as she sipped her morning tea and reflected on the web of secrets tightening around the Ithdad vicarage. The clues she had gathered, the lipstick-smeared teacup, the shallow footprint, the threatening note, the mysterious £50 withdrawal, were like scattered threads, each hinting at a deeper pattern. But it was the human element, the hidden motives and buried resentments that she knew would reveal the truth. At 10:30 a.m., Miss Marple made her way to the village shop, a hub of gossip where tongues wagged freely. Mrs. Weatherby, the shopkeeper, was quick to share the latest rumours. Dennis, the gardener's boy, had been released for lack of evidence, but suspicion now swirled around Mr. Hawes, the curate, whose nervous demeanour and Prothero's accusations had not gone unnoticed. "They say he was seen near the vicarage at dusk on the 12th, Mrs. Weatherby whispered, her eyes gleaming. "And him so pious, too." Miss Marple smiled politely, her mind dismissing the gossip, but noting its source. Village talk was often exaggerated, but it could point to truths overlooked by the police. She purchased a skein of wool and returned home, her thoughts turning to the parish accounts and the circled entry in Prothero's notes. The £50 withdrawal, initialed by Hawes, was a loose thread she could not ignore. At noon she visited the vicarage, where Griselda was attempting to maintain her usual cheer despite the strain. Leonard was absent, attending a diocesan meeting, and the house felt eerily quiet. "Miss Marple," Griselda said, her voice low, "I heard something troubling. Mary, our maid, says she saw Mr. Hawes in the lane behind the vicarage at 6 p.m. on the evening of the murder. She didn't tell Inspector Slack. She's afraid of him, but she's certain it was Hawes." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Indeed. And what was Mr. Hawes doing?" "Walking quickly," Mary said, toward the church. "He looked agitated. This was significant. The lane behind the vicarage ran parallel to the garden path near the study window. If Hawes was there at 6 p.m., he could have reached the study by 6:30, the time of the murder." Miss Marple filed this away, her mind returning to the teacup and its faint trace of lipstick. Eleanor Price's pink shade came to mind, but so did another possibility. Mrs. Martha Price, whose nervous fidgeting suggested more than mere anxiety. Determined to probe further, Miss Marple called on the Price cottage that afternoon. Mrs. Price answered the door, her face pale and her hands clutching a crumpled handkerchief. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling, "this is a dreadful time. Poor Colonel Prothero." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, stepping into the parlour. Eleanor was absent, and the room was dim, the curtains half drawn. "I wondered if you might recall anything more about the evening of October 12th. You mentioned being here with Eleanor, but I sense you're troubled by something unspoken." Mrs. Price's eyes widened, and she sank into a chair. I don't know what you mean. We were here, as I said. Eleanor was reading, and I was knitting." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her tone was firm. "My dear, secrets have a way of surfacing, especially in a village like ours. If you know something, it's better to speak now than to let it fester." The older woman's hands trembled, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "It's not what you think. Eleanor, she wasn't reading the Times. She was out, just for a moment, to post a letter. She left at 6:15 and was back by 6:45. I didn't tell the inspector because I didn't want her involved." Miss Marple's needles, resting in her lap, remained still. The postbox was a 5-minute walk from the cottage, near the Vicarage Lane. Eleanor's absence at 6:30 p.m., the time of the murder, was a critical revelation. And did she mention where she posted this letter? Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Price shook her head. No, but she was upset when she returned. Said something about needing to settle a debt. A debt. The word echoed in Miss Marple's mind, connecting to the threatening note. I know what you did. You'll pay. She thanked Mrs. Price and left, her thoughts racing. Eleanor's absence, Hawes's presence in the lane, and the parish accounts were weaving a tighter web. But another thread tugged at her. Lettice Prothero's hidden paper. That evening, Miss Marple attended a small gathering at the Prothero estate, where Lettice was hosting a few villagers to discuss funeral arrangements. The girl was pale, her movements listless, but her eyes flickered with something deeper. Guilt, perhaps, or fear. Miss Marple, ever unobtrusive, engaged her in quiet conversation by the fireplace. Lettice, my dear, she said, you seem burdened. That paper you slipped into your pocket at the tea, might it help to share what it was? Lettice's hand flew to her throat, her voice barely audible. It was a letter from Father. He gave it to me that morning, said to keep it safe. It was about the parish accounts. Something he didn't trust Mr. Hawes, with Miss Marple's heart quickened. And where is it now? I burned it, Lettice whispered, her eyes filling with tears. He told me to, if anything happened to him. I didn't read it, Miss Marple, I swear. Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind but her mind alert. A letter about the accounts, destroyed on Prothero's orders. Had Lettice truly not read it, or was she hiding its contents? The girl's grief seemed genuine, but her action suggested a deeper involvement. As she walked home under the starry sky, the church clock striking 8 p.m., Miss Marple pieced together the new threads. Eleanor's secret errand, Hawes's agitation in the lane, Lettice's burned letter, and the ever-present teacup with its telltale lipstick. Lies were surfacing, each revealing a fragment of the truth. The murderer was among them, their motive tied to money, betrayal, or both. Miss Marple's little grey cells hummed with purpose, sensing that the next revelation would bring her closer to the heart of the mystery. Chapter 8. The Emotional Turning Point. The evening of October 15th, 1925, settled over St. Mary Mead with a heavy stillness, as if the village itself were holding its breath. The murder of Colonel Lucius Prothero had fractured the community's facade of tranquility, and the weight of suspicion pressed upon every household. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her cosy cottage, her knitting needles idle for once, reflected on the tangled web of clues. The lipstick-smeared teacup, the shallow footprint, the threatening note, Eleanor Price's secret errand, Mr. Hawes's agitation, and Lettice Prothero's burned letter. Each was a stitch in the pattern, but the fabric of the crime was still incomplete. Tonight, she sensed, a crack would appear in someone's carefully guarded facade, revealing a truth that would shift the course of her investigation. At 7 p.m., Miss Marple attended a small gathering at the vicarage, organized by Griselda to discuss the upcoming memorial service for Colonel Prothero. The drawing room was dimly lit, the flickering fire casting long shadows on the faces of those assembled. Griselda, pale but composed, Leonard, his brow furrowed with worry, Dr. Haydock, his gruff manner softened by fatigue, Lettice Prothero, her eyes distant and red-rimmed, and Mrs. Martha Price, her hands twisting her ever-present handkerchief. Eleanor Price was conspicuously absent, having sent word that she was indisposed. Inspector Slack was also present, his notebook at the ready, though his air of authority seemed tempered by frustration. No new leads, he muttered to Leonard as Miss Marple entered. "Dennis is cleared. His fishing alibi checked out with a farmer who saw him at the river. Hawes is next on my list, but he's slippery as an eel." Miss Marple took her usual seat in the corner, her presence so unobtrusive that the others barely noticed her. She listened as the conversation turned to the Colonel's memorial, but her attention was fixed on the undercurrents of tension. Lettice's hands trembled as she spoke of her father's generosity to the church, her voice catching on the word duty. Mrs. Price's eyes darted nervously to the door, as if expecting Eleanor's arrival. Dr. Haydock, usually forthright, was unusually quiet, his fingers tapping restlessly on his knee. Miss Marple's mind was a whirl of details. The teacup's pink lipstick, likely Eleanor's. The shallow footprint, too deliberate for a hasty intruder. The note's scrawl, suggesting anger but precision. And the £50 withdrawal, tied to Hawes, but possibly a misdirection. Lettice's burned letter was a nagging mystery. Why destroy it unless it held a dangerous truth? And Eleanor's absence tonight was telling, especially after Mrs. Price's revelation about her niece's errand at 6:15 p.m. on the high murder night. As Griselda served tea, the conversation faltered, and an uneasy silence fell. It was then that Mrs. Price's composure broke. Her handkerchief fell to the floor, and she let out a choked sob. "I can't bear it any longer," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's not right, keeping silent when a man's dead." The room froze. Inspector Slack's pencil hovered over his notebook, and Griselda's teapot clattered against a cup. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp as ever, fixed on Mrs. Price, though her expression remained gentle. "My dear," she said softly, "what troubles you so?" Mrs. Price's hands shook violently. "It's Eleanor," she said, her voice breaking. "She wasn't just posting a letter that evening. She met someone near the Vicarage Lane. I saw her leave at 6:15, and when she came back at 6:45, she was shaking, muttering about settling things once and for all. I didn't tell you, Inspector, because I thought it was nothing. But now I'm afraid." Slack leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Who did she meet, Mrs. Price? Speak plainly." "I don't know," Mrs. Price cried, tears streaming down her face. "She wouldn't say, only that it was someone who owed her something, money, I think. She's been so secretive since we came to Saint. Mary Mead, always talking of debts and promises. I thought it was just her way. But now, with the Colonel dead, Miss Marple's needles, though absent, seemed to click in her mind. Eleanor's errand at 6:15 placed her near the vicarage at the time of the murder. The lipstick on the teacup suggested she had been in the study, perhaps meeting Prothero himself. Was the debt tied to the parish accounts or something more personal? The note, "I know what you did. You'll pay," took on new weight, its words echoing Mrs. Price's account of Eleanor's mutterings. Lettice, silent until now, let out a small gasp. "Eleanor! But she barely knew father. Why would she—" Her voice trailed off, and her eyes met Miss Marple's, wide with fear. Miss Marple remained calm, her mind racing. "Miss Prothero," she said gently, "your father's letter, the one you burned, did it mention Miss Price at all?" Lettice's face paled, and she shook her head. But her hesitation was telling. It was about the accounts," she stammered. "Father said someone was cheating the church, but he didn't name names. I burned it because he told me to, not because I read it." Slack scribbled furiously, his focus now on Eleanor. "We'll bring Miss Price in tomorrow," he declared. "If she was in the lane at 6:30, she's got questions to answer." Dr. Haydock spoke up, his voice gruff but strained. "Be careful, Inspector." Eleanor's sharp, but she's no fool. If she was involved, she'll have covered her tracks." Miss Marple noted Haydock's tone, a mix of warning and unease. Did he know more than he let on? So, glances at Lettice during the evening had been frequent, almost protective. Was he shielding her, or someone else? As the gathering dispersed, Mrs. Price was escorted home by Griselda, still weeping, while Slack stormed off to prepare for Eleanor's questioning. Miss Marple lingered, her gaze falling on the vicarage's hall clock, which read 8:45 p.m. The emotional outburst had cracked the case open, but not fully. Eleanor's meeting, the lipstick, the burned letter, all pointed to a web of financial and personal entanglements. Was Eleanor the key, or was she another red herring, diverting attention from a subtler truth? As she walked home through the quiet lanes, the church clock striking 9 p.m., Miss Marple's little grey cells hummed. Mrs. Price's confession was a turning point, but the pattern was not yet complete. The truth, she knew, lay in the delicate interplay of motive and opportunity, and she was closer than ever to unravelling it. Chapter 9. The Trap. The morning of October 16th, 1925, dawned crisp and clear in St. Mary Mead, the autumn sun casting long shadows across the village's quiet lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, her knitting a pretext for the intense concentration that gripped her. The murder of Colonel Lucius Prothero was a puzzle nearing its resolution, and Mrs. Price's emotional outburst the previous evening had provided a crucial piece. Eleanor Price's secret meeting near the Vicarage Lane at 6:15 p.m., the lipstick-smeared teacup, the burned letter, and the £50 withdrawal from the parish accounts, all pointed to a web of deceit that Miss Marple was determined to untangle. Today she resolved to set a trap, not with force, but with the subtle pressure of observation and carefully chosen words. At 11 a.m., Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage, where Inspector Slack had gathered the key figures for what he called a final round of questions. The drawing-room was crowded, the air thick with tension. Griselda and Leonard sat close together, their faces etched with worry. Dr. Haydock leaned against the mantel, his gruff exterior masking a watchful intensity. Lettice Prothero perched on the edge of a chair, her hands clasped tightly. Mrs. Martha Price, still shaken from her confession, avoided everyone's gaze. And Eleanor Price, summoned at last, stood with her usual composure, though her sharp eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Mr. Hawes, the curate, was also present, his nervous fidgeting more pronounced than ever. Inspector Slack paced the room, his notebook open. "We're close to cracking this," he declared, his voice sharp. "Miss Eleanor Price, your aunt says you were out at 6:15 p.m. on October 12th, near the Vicarage Lane, meeting someone about a debt. Care to explain?" Eleanor's expression remained cool, her voice steady. "My aunt is mistaken. I went to post a letter, as I said. I met no one. I was back by 6:45, as she confirmed." Mrs. Price's hands twisted her handkerchief, but she said nothing, her eyes fixed on the floor. Miss Marple, seated quietly in her corner, noted the older woman's silence. Eleanor's alibi was fraying, and Mrs. Price's reluctance to contradict her niece suggested fear or complicity. Slack turned to Mr. Hawes, whose face was pale. "And you, sir, Mary, the maid, saw you in the lane at 6 p.m., looking agitated. You told us you were at the church, preparing for evensong. Which is it?" Hawes's voice trembled. I was at the church, but I stepped out briefly to clear my head. The Colonel's accusations about the accounts were overwhelming. I walked the lane, then returned. I swear I didn't go near the vicarage. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her eyes darting between Hawes and Eleanor. Both were hiding something, but their stories were too carefully constructed, too rehearsed. She decided it was time to apply pressure. "Inspector," she said, her voice mild but clear. "Might I ask Miss Price about the teacup in the study? The one with the pink lipstick, quite like the shade you wore at the tea." Eleanor's composure faltered for a moment, her hand brushing her lips. "A teacup? I don't recall drinking tea in the study. Perhaps it was Griselda's." Griselda shook her head, her voice firm. "I don't wear lipstick, Miss Price, and the maids cleared the tea things by 5 p.m. That cup was left after the tea." The room grew still, all eyes on Eleanor. Slack seized the moment. "So, you were in the study, Miss Price? When and why?" Eleanor's eyes narrowed, but she held her ground. "I wasn't there. You're mistaken." Miss Marple's tone remained gentle, but her words were precise. "And the note, Miss Price. I know what you did. You'll pay. Your aunt mentioned you spoke of settling a debt that evening. Could the note have been yours?" The accusation hung in the air, and Eleanor's face flushed, though she quickly regained control. "That's absurd. I had no quarrel with Colonel Prothero. Why would I write such a thing?" Lettice, who had been silent, suddenly spoke, her voice trembling. "Father knew something about someone. He told me so that morning. He said he'd found proof in the accounts, something that would ruin them. That's why he wrote the letter I burned. I didn't read it, but maybe it was about Miss Price." Eleanor's eyes flashed with anger, but before she could respond, Mr. Hawes stood, his voice breaking. "It wasn't her. It was me. The £50. I took it, not for myself, but to help someone. Colonel Prothero found out and threatened to expose me. I didn't kill him, I swear, but I was in the lane because I was going to confront him, to beg him to keep quiet." The room erupted in gasps, and Slack's pencil flew across his notebook. Miss Marple, however, remained calm, her mind piecing together the revelations. Hawes's confession explained the withdrawal, but not the murder. The teacup, the note, and Eleanor's meeting suggested a deeper connection, one that Hawes's outburst might be shielding. "Mr. Hawes," Miss Marple said softly, "who are you helping with that £50? It's important to be truthful now." Hawes's face crumpled, and he sank back into his chair. "It was a private matter. A friend in need. I can't say more." Slack, sensing weakness, pressed forward. "You'll say more at the station, sir. And Miss Price, you're coming too. We'll get to the bottom of this." As the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze falling on Lettice, who was trembling. "Lettice, my dear," she said gently, "your father's letter, did it mention anyone by name?" Lettice shook her head, tears spilling over. "No, but he said it was someone close, someone he trusted. I thought it was Mr. Hawes, but now I don't know." Miss Marple nodded, her trap having yielded results. Hawes's confession and Eleanor's defensiveness had cracked their facades. But the truth remained elusive. The teacup, the footprint, the note, and the burned letter pointed to a conspiracy, perhaps involving more than one person. As she left the vicarage, the church clock striking 1 p.m., Miss Marple felt the pattern tightening. The murderer was among them, their motive tied to money, trust, and betrayal. One more push, she thought, and the truth would unravel. Chapter 10. The Reveal. The afternoon of October 16th, 1925, draped St. Mary Mead in a golden haze, the autumn light filtering through the vicarage windows, as Miss Jane Marple prepared to unveil the truth behind Colonel Lucius Prothero's murder. The drawing-room was once again the stage, its air thick with anticipation, as Inspector Slack, Griselda, Leonard, Dr. Haydock, Lettice Prothero, Mrs. Martha Price, Eleanor Price, and Mr. Hawes gathered at Miss Marple's quiet insistence. She had asked for this assembly, promising to clarify the tangled web of clues that had confounded the police. Her demeanour was as unassuming as ever, her knitting in her lap, but her pale blue eyes gleamed with the certainty of a mind that had pieced together the puzzle. Inspector Slack, though sceptical, allowed her to speak, his notebook open but his expression impatient. "Miss Marple," he said, "if you've got something to say, make it quick. We're taking Hawes and Miss Price to the station after this." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her voice calm but commanding attention. "Patience, Inspector. The truth requires precision, not haste. Let us review the facts, step by step, and see where they lead us." She began, her words measured. Colonel Prothero was shot in the vicarage study at 6:30 p.m. on October 12, 1925. A Webley revolver, wiped clean of fingerprints, lay beside him, along with a note. "I know what you did. You'll pay." The study window was ajar, a scuff mark on the sill and a shallow footprint in the garden suggesting an intruder, or a staged one. A teacup, bearing pink lipstick, sat on the desk, cold despite the tea being served at 4 p.m. And the parish accounts, with a £50 withdrawal initialed by Mr. Hawes, pointed to financial motives. These are our threads. The room was silent, all eyes on her. She continued. At first, suspicion fell on Dennis, the gardener's boy, but his alibi held. Then Mr. Hawes, accused by the colonel of theft, admitted to taking the £50 for a friend in need. Miss Eleanor Price, seen near the vicarage lane at 6:15 p.m., spoke of settling a debt. And Miss Lettice Prothero burned a letter from her father, claiming it concerned the accounts but naming no names. Each of you has a piece of the truth, but only one fits the pattern of the crime. Miss Marple turned to Eleanor Price, whose composure was strained. "Miss Price, your lipstick matches the smudge on the teacup. You were in the study after the tea, were you not?" Eleanor's eyes narrowed, but she nodded. "I went to speak to the colonel at 5:30 p.m. after the others left. He was alive when I left at 5:45. I only wanted to discuss a private matter. A loan he'd promised but never delivered." "A loan," Miss Marple mused. "Yet your aunt said you spoke of settling a debt at 6:45 p.m. after meeting someone in the lane. Was that meeting with the colonel? Perhaps to deliver the note?" Eleanor's face paled. "No, I met no one. I posted a letter as I said." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Mr. Hawes, whose hands trembled. "And you, Mr. Hawes, admitted to taking the £50. You said it was for a friend. Was that friend Miss Price?" Hawes's eyes widened, but he shook his head. "No, it was someone else. I can't say." Miss Marple's voice softened, but her words cut like a blade. "You can, and you must. The friend was Lettice Prothero, was it not?" Lettice gasped, her hands flying to her face. The room erupted in murmurs, but Miss Marple raised a hand for silence. "Let me explain. Colonel Prothero suspected theft in the parish accounts, focusing on Mr. Hawes. but the £50 was taken to help Lettice, who was in debt, a secret she kept from her father. The Colonel discovered this, didn't he, Lettice? His letter, which you burned, named you and Mr. Hawes, threatening to expose you both. Lettice's voice was a whisper. He found out I'd borrowed money from a friend in London. He was furious, said I'd disgraced him. He wrote the letter to confront Mr. Hawes, but I burned it to protect us both. Miss Marple nodded. But someone else knew. Miss Price, you learned of the Colonel's suspicions, perhaps through village gossip or a conversation at the tea. You saw an opportunity. You wrote the note. I know what you did. You'll pay, not to the Colonel, but to Lettice, threatening to reveal her debt unless she paid you. You slipped it into the study during your visit at 5:30, leaving the teacup as evidence of your presence. Eleanor's face was ashen. That's preposterous. I wrote no such note. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. But you did, Miss Price. The handwriting matches a letter you sent to the parish committee last month. I checked. You intended to blackmail Lettice, but the Colonel found the note first, believing it was meant for him. His temper flared, and he confronted you in the lane at 6:15 p.m., didn't he? Mrs. Price sobbed, unable to contain herself. She came back so upset, saying he'd threatened to ruin her. Eleanor stood, her voice sharp. This is nonsense. You've no proof, Miss Marple continued, undeterred. The proof is in the details. The shallow footprint was yours, Miss Price, made by your light step as you climbed through the study window at 6:30 p.m. after your confrontation. You shot the Colonel with his own revolver, kept in the study drawer. He'd shown it to you during your earlier talk, hadn't he? You wiped it clean, left the note to misdirect, and staged the scene to suggest an intruder. Slack's jaw dropped, but he recovered quickly. Why her, Miss Marple? What's the motive? Money and fear, Miss Marple said. Eleanor came to St. Mary Mead to escape debts of her own. She saw Lettice's secret as a way to extort funds. When the Colonel discovered her plan, he threatened to expose her, perhaps even to the police. She acted to silence him, using the very note meant for Lettice to confuse us. Lettice broke down, sobbing. I didn't know. I thought Father was angry at me, not her. Eleanor's composure shattered, her voice rising. You can't prove any of this. Miss Marple's smile was serene. The police will find your shoes match the footprint, Miss Price, and the note's ink matches your fountain pen, which I noticed at the tea. The truth is in the details. Slack, stunned, signalled to Constable Hurst. Take Miss Price into custody. We'll verify this. As Eleanor was led away protesting, the room fell silent. Miss Marple gathered her knitting, her work done. The pattern was complete, the truth revealed through logic, observation, and the subtle contradictions of human nature. Chapter 11. The Reflection. The evening of October 16th, 1925, cast a gentle glow over St. Mary Mead, the village settling into a fragile calm after the storm of Colonel Lucius Prothero's murder. The vicarage, so recently a scene of chaos and revelation, now felt quieter, though the echoes of truth lingered in its walls. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking softly, a cup of tea at her side. Griselda and Leonard, still shaken by the day's events, had invited her to stay for supper, seeking the comfort of her steady presence. Dr. Haydock was there too, his gruff demeanour softened by a rare admiration, while Lettice Prothero, though pale and subdued, seemed lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. Inspector Slack had departed with Eleanor Price in custody, her protests fading as she was led to the police car. The evidence Miss Marple had laid bare, the lipstick-smeared teacup, the shallow footprint, the note's handwriting, and the timeline of Eleanor's movements, had been enough to convince Slack to act. He promised to verify the footprint and the ink, but Miss Marple had no doubt they would match. The truth, as she knew, always lay in the details, and she had woven them into a pattern none could unravel. Griselda, pouring tea, broke the silence. "Miss Marple, I don't know how you did it. Eleanor seemed so composed, so above suspicion. How did you know it was her?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, her voice gentle but precise. "My dear, it is not so much knowing as seeing. People are like my knitting. Each stitch must be in its place, or the whole falls apart." Eleanor's composure was her mask, but the teacup, the note, her absence at 6:15 p.m., these were stitches out of place. And then there was the human heart, always so quick to betray itself. Leonard, his face weary but relieved, leaned forward. "But why kill Colonel Prothero? If she meant to blackmail Lettice, why not stop there?" Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her expression thoughtful. "Fear, Reverend, is a powerful motive. Colonel Prothero was a man of iron will and little mercy. When he found Eleanor's note, meant for Lettice, he saw through her scheme. He confronted her in the lane, threatening exposure, perhaps ruin, perhaps prison. Eleanor, already burdened by debts, could not risk it. She acted in desperation, using the Colonel's own revolver to silence him and staging the scene to suggest an intruder." Dr. Haydock nodded, his voice gruff. "Clever, but not clever enough. That teacup was a blunder. And the footprint, most wouldn't have noticed it." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Most don't, Doctor. But in a village like St. Mary Mead, where life moves slowly, one learns to notice the small things, the glance, the hesitation, the misplaced object. They tell a story, if one listens." Lettice, who had been silent, spoke softly, her voice trembling. "I feel so foolish, Miss Marple. Father's letter, I burned it to protect myself, but it might have saved him if I'd told someone." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "My dear, guilt is a heavy burden, but it does not change the past. Your father's letter was a piece of the puzzle, but Eleanor's actions were her own. You could not have foreseen them." Griselda reached for Lettice's hand, her eyes brimming with tears. "You've been through so much, Lettice. And Mr. Hawes, will he be all right?" Miss Marple nodded. "Mr. Hawes's fault was in his loyalty, not his malice. He took the £50 to help you, Lettice, and his silence was to protect you. The police will be lenient, I think, once the full truth is known." The room fell quiet, the fire crackling softly. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind drifting to the broader tapestry of human nature. "People," she said, almost to herself, "are so predictable in their unpredictability. They hide their fears, their desires, their sins, but they always leave traces, a word, a look, a teacup. It is our task to see them clearly." Dr. Haydock chuckled, a rare sound. "You're a marvel, Miss Marple. The police could learn a thing or two from you." She waved a hand dismissively. "I am merely an old woman who notices what others overlook. The world is full of patterns, Doctor, and a village is no different from a city in that regard. The human heart is the same everywhere." As the evening drew to a close, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to leave. The church clock struck 9 p.m. Its chimes a reminder of the order restored to St. Mary Mead. She stepped into the cool night, the stars bright above, and walked slowly home, her mind at peace. The mystery was solved, the truth revealed, and the village could begin to heal. Yet, as she reached her cottage, Miss Marple paused, her thoughts lingering on the fragility of trust and the weight of secrets. She had seen much in her years in St. Mary Mead, and she knew this would not be the last time her little grey cells were called upon. With a quiet smile, she entered her home, ready to resume her knitting, and her watch over the village she knew so well. Chapter 12. The Shadows of Truth. The morning of October 17th, 1925, greeted St. Mary Mead with a crisp clarity. The autumn air sharp, and the village lanes dappled with sunlight filtering through golden leaves. The resolution of Colonel Lucius Prothero's murder had brought a tentative peace, but Miss Jane Marple knew that truth, once revealed, often left ripples that lingered long after the surface seemed calm. She sat in her cottage, her knitting needles moving rhythmically, her mind sifting through the events of the previous day. Eleanor Price's arrest had closed the case, yet certain details, the burned letter, Mr. Hawes's reticence, and Lettice's guilt, nagged at her, suggesting shadows yet to be dispelled. At 10 a.m., Miss Marple walked to the vicarage, where Griselda had invited her to discuss the parish's plans for the memorial service. The drawing-room was brighter today, the curtains drawn back, but a subtle tension remained. Griselda, ever resilient, was arranging a vase of chrysanthemums, while Leonard reviewed notes for the service. Dr. Haydock arrived shortly after, his presence a steadying force, and Lettice Prothero joined them, her face pale, but her eyes clearer than they had been. "Miss Marple," Griselda said, her voice warm but tinged with curiosity, "you were so certain yesterday. How did you know Eleanor would break under your questions?" Miss Marple smiled, her needles pausing. "My dear, it was not a matter of breaking her, but of showing her that the truth could not be hidden. The teacup, the footprint, the note, these were her mistakes, and she knew it. People, when cornered by their own errors, often reveal more than they intend." Leonard looked up from his notes, his brow furrowed. "But what of Mr. Hawes? He admitted to taking the £50, yet you seem to believe his intentions were honourable." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied. "Mr. Hawes is a man of weak resolve, but good heart. He took the money to help Lettice, believing it a small sin for a greater good. His silence was his attempt to protect her, though it nearly cost him dearly." Lettice, seated by the window, spoke softly. "I should have told the truth about Father's letter from the start. If I hadn't burned it, perhaps none of this would have happened." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "My dear, you acted out of fear, as many do. Your father's letter was a threat to expose not just Mr. Hawes, but you as well. Burning it was your way of shielding yourself, but it also shielded Eleanor's scheme until the truth came to light." Dr. Haydock, leaning against the mantel, cleared his throat. "There's one thing I don't understand, Miss Marple. The note, 'I know what you did, you'll pay,' was meant for Lettice, you said. But how did Eleanor know about Lettice's debt in the first place?" Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. "A good question, Doctor. Eleanor Price is a woman of sharp observation. much like myself, though her motives are less benevolent. She likely overheard a conversation, perhaps between Lettice and Mr. Hawes, or even at the tea on October 12th, when Lettice's distress was evident. Villages, you know, are full of whispers, and Eleanor was adept at listening. Griselda frowned. But to kill Colonel Prothero over it, it seems so extreme. Fear and desperation, Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but firm, can drive even the most composed to desperate acts. Eleanor's debts were pressing, and the Colonel's threat to expose her blackmail attempt was a danger she could not afford. She acted swiftly, using the very note meant for Lettice to create confusion. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, his manner less brusque than usual. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat, "I owe you an apology." The footprint matches Miss Price's shoes, and the ink on the note came from her fountain pen. "She's confessed," said she shot the Colonel in a panic after he threatened to have her arrested for blackmail. Miss Marple nodded, unsurprised. "And the revolver?" "Prothero's own, kept in the study drawer," Slack confirmed. "She admitted to wiping it clean and staging the window to suggest an intruder. You were right about every detail." Griselda's eyes widened. "Then it's truly over?" "For now," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but cautious. "But truth, my dear, is like a garden. It requires tending. There's still questions, small ones that may yet need answers." Slack raised an eyebrow. "Questions?" "The case is closed, Miss Marple." She smiled faintly. "Perhaps, Inspector, but I wonder about Mr. Hawes's friend in need. Lettice's debt was one matter, but was there another? And Lettice's letter, did it truly name no one else?" Lettice's face flushed, but she said nothing. Dr. Haydock's gaze lingered on her, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple made a mental note, sensing that some secrets remained buried, though they posed no threat to the case's resolution. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her thoughts turning to the broader canvas of St. Mary Mead. The village would heal, but its scars would remain, a reminder that even in the quietest places, human nature could twist into darkness. She gathered her knitting and stepped into the afternoon light, the church clock striking 1 p.m. The mystery was solved, but her watch over the village would continue, her little grey cells ever ready for the next pattern to emerge. Chapter 13. The Lingering Threads. The morning of October 18th, 1925, brought a soft golden light to St. Mary Mead, the village's tranquillity slowly reasserting itself after the upheaval of Colonel Lucius Prothero's murder. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, though her mind was far from idle. Eleanor Price's confession had tied up the case neatly for Inspector Slack, but Miss Marple's keen sense of human nature told her that some threads remained loose, dangling just out of reach. The burned letter, Mr. Hawes's unspoken loyalties, and Lettice Prothero's lingering guilt hinted at truths not fully uncovered, and she was determined to see the pattern complete. At 11 a.m., Miss Marple made her way to the church, where the memorial service for Colonel Prothero was to be held. The village had gathered in force, their faces a mix of solemnity and curiosity, eager to pay respects, but also to whisper about the scandal that had rocked their quiet lives. The pews were filled with familiar figures, Griselda and Leonard, their expressions sombre but united. Dr. Haydock, his gruff demeanour softened by the occasion. Lettice, her eyes downcast, clutching a handkerchief. And Mrs. Martha Price, alone now, her face etched with shame and sorrow. Mr. Hawes stood at the pulpit, his hands trembling as he prepared to deliver a brief eulogy, his role as curate now under scrutiny. Miss Marple took a seat near the back, her presence unobtrusive, but her eyes sharp, noting the small interactions that spoke louder than words. Lettice's hand brushed Dr. Haydock's as he offered her a reassuring nod, a gesture too familiar for mere acquaintance. Mrs. Price's gaze lingered on the vicar, as if seeking forgiveness for her niece's actions, and Mr. Hawes, his voice faltering during the eulogy, avoided mentioning the Colonel's accusations, focusing instead on his contributions to the parish. After the service, Miss Marple lingered in the churchyard, where the villagers mingled under the ancient yews. She approached Lettice, who stood alone by her father's freshly marked grave, her face pale but resolute. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "you carry a heavy burden. Is there more you wish to share about your father's letter?" Lettice's eyes filled with tears, but she shook her head. "I told you, Miss Marple, I didn't read it. He said to burn it if anything happened to him, and I did. I thought I was protecting someone." "Someone?" Miss Marple echoed, her tone kind but probing. "Not just yourself, perhaps? Or Mr. Hawes?" Lettice's breath caught, and she glanced toward the church, where Dr. Haydock was speaking with Leonard. "It's not what you think," she whispered. "Father knew about my debt, but he also suspected other things. He didn't say what, only that someone close had betrayed him." Miss Marple's mind quickened. The Colonel's suspicions had been broader than the parish accounts then. Had he uncovered another secret, one that Eleanor exploited? She thanked Lettice and moved toward Doctor Haydock, who was lighting a cigarette, his face weary. "Doctor," she said, her voice soft, "you've been most kind to Lettice through this ordeal. A family friend, perhaps?" Haydock's eyes flickered, but he nodded. "Her mother was a dear friend before she passed. I've tried to look out for Lettice, especially with Prothero's temper." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "And yet, your concern seems more than neighbourly. Did the Colonel know of any attachment between you and Lettice?" Haydock's cigarette paused halfway to his mouth, his expression guarded. "Attachment? She's a child, Miss Marple. I've only tried to help her through her troubles." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone disarming. But her mind noted the doctor's defensiveness, the way his gaze lingered on Lettice. Had Colonel Prothero suspected an inappropriate connection, one that fueled his anger and led to the letter? It was a thread worth tugging. Later, at the vicarage for tea, Miss Marple spoke with Griselda and Leonard, who were grappling with the parish's shaken trust. "The accounts are cleared," Leonard said, his voice heavy. "Hawes has promised to repay the £50, and the bishop has agreed to overlook the matter, given the circumstances." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on Mr. Hawes, who stood apart, speaking quietly with Mrs. Price. "Mr. Hawes's loyalty to Lettice was his undoing," she said, "but I wonder if his silence protects another secret, one the Colonel may have uncovered." Griselda frowned. "Another secret? Miss Marple, you don't think there's more to this, do you?" Eleanor confessed. "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, "and her guilt is certain." But human motives are rarely singular. The Colonel's letter burned by Lettice may have held more than accusations about money. It may have pointed to a betrayal closer to home. As the tea concluded, Miss Marple walked home, the church clock striking 3 p.m. Her little grey cells were at work, weaving the final threads. Lettice's guilt, Haydock's protectiveness, Hawes's silence, and the Colonel's suspicions of betrayal. Eleanor's crime was clear, but the shadows of other secrets, perhaps a forbidden affection or a hidden alliance, lingered. Miss Marple knew that some truths remained buried, not out of malice, but out of human frailty. For now, she would let them rest, content that justice had been served, but ever watchful for the next ripple in St. Mary Mead's quiet waters. Chapter 14. The Unseen Motives. The afternoon of October 19th, 1925, bathed St. Mary Mead in a soft amber glow, the autumn leaves rustling gently as a cool breeze swept through the village. The resolution of Colonel Lucius Prothero's murder had restored a semblance of peace, but Miss Jane Marple, ever attuned to the undercurrents of human nature, sensed that the ripples of the crime had not yet fully settled. She sat in her cottage, her knitting needles moving with a steady rhythm, her mind weaving through the lingering threads of the mystery. Lettice Prothero's burned letter, Dr. Haydock's protective glances, and Mr. Hawes's guarded silence. While Eleanor Price's confession had closed the case for the police, Miss Marple knew that the full truth was often more complex than a single act of guilt. At 2 p.m., Miss Marple decided to visit Dr. Haydock at his surgery, ostensibly to discuss a minor ailment, but in truth to probe the shadows she had glimpsed at the memorial service. The doctor's small office was cluttered with medical books and instruments, a stark contrast to his usually composed demeanour. He greeted her with a gruff smile, his eyes wary. "Miss Marple, to what do I owe this visit? Not another mystery, I hope?" She smiled faintly, settling into a chair. "Not precisely, Doctor, but I find that mysteries, like illnesses, sometimes leave symptoms that linger. I've been thinking about Lettice Prothero and her father's suspicions. You've been a great support to her, and I wonder if there's more to her troubles than the debt we know of." Haydock's expression tightened, his fingers drumming on the desk. "Lettice is young, Miss Marple, and her father was a hard man. She's had a rough time, but I've only tried to be a friend." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but her eyes sharp. "Yet I couldn't help noticing your concern for her at the memorial. Colonel Prothero's letter, the one Lettice burned, hinted at a betrayal. Could it have been about you, Doctor? An attachment, perhaps, that he disapproved of?" Haydock's face flushed, and he stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "You're fishing, Miss Marple. Lettice is like a daughter to me. Her mother and I were close, years ago, before she married Prothero. I promised to look after the girl, that's all." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly in her lap. "A promise is a powerful thing, Doctor, but promises can lead to misunderstandings. Did the Colonel suspect your intentions were more than paternal?" Haydock's shoulders sagged, and he turned to face her, his voice low. "He did. Last month, he saw me comforting Lettice after one of his tirades. She was crying about her debts, and I gave her advice, nothing more. But Prothero accused me of improper feelings. He threatened to ruin my reputation if I didn't keep my distance. I told him he was wrong, but he wouldn't listen." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was alert. "And this was in the letter Lettice burned?" I don't know, Haydock admitted. She never told me what it said, only that it was dangerous. I swear, Miss Marple, I had nothing to do with his death. I believe you, she said, her voice calm. But your silence, like Mr. Hawes's, protected Lettice at a cost. It gave Eleanor Price the opportunity to exploit the situation. Leaving the surgery, Miss Marple walked to the Protheroe estate to speak with Lettice. The girl was in the garden, tending to a rose bush, her movements slow and deliberate. "Miss Marple," she said, looking up, "I didn't expect you. Is something wrong?" "Not wrong, my dear," Miss Marple replied, "but unfinished." "Your father's letter. Did it mention Dr. Haydock?" Lettice's hands froze, and her eyes filled with tears. "You know, don't you? Father thought Dr. Haydock was too close to me. He wrote that he'd expose him, ruin him if he didn't stay away. I burned the letter because I didn't want Dr. Haydock hurt. He's been kind, nothing more." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions confirmed. The Colonel's paranoia had cast a wider net than the parish accounts, ensnaring Haydock in his accusations. Lettice's act of burning the letter was not just to hide her debt, but to shield a man she trusted. Yet this act had unwittingly given Eleanor the chance to act, her blackmail scheme spiralling into murder. As Miss Marple returned home, the church clock struck 4 p.m., its chimes a steady reminder of order. She sat in her parlour, her knitting resuming its rhythm, and reflected on the unseen motives that had shaped the crime. Eleanor's desperation had driven her to murder, but the Colonel's suspicions of Hawes, of Lettice, of Haydock had created the conditions for her act. Each player had acted from their own fears and loyalties, their secrets intertwining to form a deadly pattern. Miss Marple knew that some truths would remain in the shadows, spoken only in the quiet of her own mind. The village would move on, its surface calm restored, but she would continue to watch. Her little grey cells ever alert to the frailties and passions that lay beneath St. Mary Mead's tranquil facade. Chapter 15. The Quiet Restoration. The evening of October 20th, 1925, settled over St. Mary Mead with a serene hush, the village's wounds beginning to heal under the gentle touch of time. The golden light of autumn had softened, giving way to the cool promise of twilight. And Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage, her knitting needles moving with their familiar cadence. The murder of Colonel Lucius Protheroe had been solved, Eleanor Price's confession sealing her fate, yet the ripples of the crime lingered in the hearts of those involved. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the subtleties of human nature, knew that the restoration of peace required not just justice, but understanding, and she had one final task to ensure the village could move forward. At 6 p.m., Miss Marple joined a small gathering at the vicarage, where Griselda and Leonard had invited a few close friends to mark the end of the ordeal. The drawing room, once a stage for tension and revelation, now glowed with warmth, the fire crackling cheerfully. Griselda, her vivacity returning, poured tea, while Leonard, his demeanour calmer, spoke of plans to rebuild the parish's trust. Dr. Haydock was present, his gruff exterior softened by relief, and Lettice Protheroe, though still fragile, showed signs of resilience, her eyes brighter than they had been. Mr. Hawes, reinstated as curate with the bishop's reluctant approval, sat quietly, his nervous energy subdued. Mrs. Martha Price, still shaken by her niece's actions, had declined the invitation, choosing solitude to mourn her family's disgrace. As the group settled, Griselda turned to Miss Marple, her voice warm with gratitude. "Miss Marple, you've given us back our peace. I don't know how we'd have managed without you. But I still wonder, how did you see what the police missed?" Miss Marple's needles paused, her smile gentle but knowing. "My dear, it is not so much seeing as listening. To the small things, the hesitations, the glances that betray what words conceal. The teacup, the footprint, the note, these were but signs of human frailty, of fear and desperation. Eleanor Price's crime was born of her own secrets, but it was the secrets of others that gave her the opportunity." Leonard nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You mentioned the letter Lettuce burned. It seemed to hold so much, yet we'll never know its full contents." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Perhaps not, Reverend, but we know enough. The letter spoke of betrayal, of debts and misplaced trust. It named Mr. Hawes, yes, but also Dr. Haydock, whose kindness to Lettuce was misread by her father's jealous heart. Lettuce burned it to protect them both, not knowing it would shield Eleanor's darker intent. Lettuce, stirring her tea, spoke softly. "I should have trusted you, Miss Marple. If I'd shown you the letter, perhaps Father would still be alive." Miss Marple reached out, her hand resting lightly on Lettuce's. "My dear, you acted from love and fear, as so many do. Your father's suspicions created a storm, but Eleanor's choices were her own. You bear no blame for her actions." Dr. Haydock cleared his throat, his voice gruff but sincere. "You've a rare gift, Miss Marple. You saw through us all, my promise to Lettuce's mother, Hawes's misguided loyalty, even Eleanor's calculated facade. I thought I was protecting Lettuce by keeping silent, but I only muddied the waters." Miss Marple's smile was kind. Silence, Doctor, is often a shield, but it can also be a trap. You and Mr. Hawes meant well, but secrets have a way of twisting truth. Eleanor saw that twist and used it to her advantage. Mr. Hawes, his face pale but resolute, spoke for the first time. "I've repaid the £50, Miss Marple, and I've sworn to be transparent with the accounts. But I still feel I failed the parish and Lettuce." "You failed no one," Miss Marple said firmly. "Your mistake was one of judgment, not heart. The parish will forgive, as it always does, when honesty prevails." Griselda, setting down her teacup, leaned forward. "And what of Mrs. Price? She's so alone now, with Eleanor gone. Should we reach out to her?" Miss Marple nodded. "You are kind to think of her, Griselda. Mrs. Price's burden is heavy, but time and compassion will ease it." She knew of Eleanor's troubles, but could not stop her. A visit, perhaps, would show her that St. Mary Mead does not turn away from those who suffer. As the evening drew to a close, the church clock struck 8 p.m., its chimes a steady reminder of the village's enduring rhythm. Miss Marple gathered her knitting, her work here complete. The mystery had been solved, the truth laid bare, and the village was knitting itself back together stitch by careful stitch. Yet she knew that St. Mary Mead, like all places, held countless unseen stories, waiting for the right moment to surface. Stepping into the cool night, Miss Marple walked home, her mind at ease but ever watchful. The stars above were bright, and the quiet of the village wrapped around her like a familiar shawl. She had restored order, but her little grey cells remained ready. For in the heart of every village, there was always another pattern waiting to be unravelled.